Suspicion is an interesting one. I'd nominate it as one of Hitchcock's finest acts of execution, although it is one where, in the events of the screenplay, the character psychologies must be placed in some narrative or historical social context. It was so easy for me to imagine certain people in my life having major issues of how Joan Fontaine's character, Lena McLeod-Law, is depicted, and perhaps rightfully so. But one must remember that Hitchcock is dealing with melodramatic extremes in order to get the most out of his suspenseful, larger than life thrillers, but also to illustrate pathological extremes in a rather bold fusion of classical dramatic demonstrations with the more than contemporary post industrial social maneuvering rat race market economy, distinct from the abstracted dimensions where the Greeks of antiquity placed their narratives, or from where Shakespeare tended to set his tales amongst some rigid feudal chains, nobility common born, and destiny determined by one's birthing context. In the Suspicion script, Hitchcock examined the most extreme fears pertaining male behaviour, that they are never truly honest and see their bride as a prize more so than a partner, but also, more jarringly, the radical extremes associated with female behaviour, perhaps at that time. The behaviour of Lena falling in love with Cary Grant's Johnny for reasons which seem incredibly superficial to us now seems to be representing a kind of patriarch's fear of their feminine brood, to be taken advantage of unknowingly by some snickering amoral conman, a rank condescension perhaps in and of itself. In fact, Hitchcock's apparent intended ending for the film makes one question his views on women in general. That Lena was willing to let Johnny murder her because she loved him so much seems so divorced from lived, believable behaviour, or at least in the context of how the film portrays their relationship. One wonders if anything so over the top occurred in the aforementioned patriarchal classics. Did Hitchcock's wife Alma really let him get away with that? She was one of the credited screenwriters. Perhaps Alma may have understood that they were dealing with in sensational over the top drama. Hitchcock films are considered very classy now, but it was only the French who saw the high art value in his work at one time, and they were also known for thinking Jerry Lewis was a genius, so the English language discourse didn't take their appraisal so seriously. I don't mean that as a diss against Jerry Lewis personally, but he was not considered. He was considered very lowbrow in the English language world at that time, even by film critics and such. Whereas now he's more praised, but like Hitchcock, the French were early to that. Hitchcock, the man was a populist. He had more in common with a John Grisham type than some might want to admit, and obviously he put a lot more care and thought into his films as both technical undertakings and a psychological explorations than a page-turner author like Grisham or Clancy or whomever might, even considering their different mediums of choice. Hitchcock was an advocate of populist entertainment at the end of the day. He was just willing, or was permitted to be, as technical of the medium as he liked, and also to demonstrate more modern, psychologically rooted concepts within his films. Remember the more biblically inclined or otherwise value-driven drama which dominates the 50s. Few Hollywood dramas feel like depictions of human psychology as we understand it, and more like dramatic archetypes. Hitchcock is more of a fusion of these two. As well as his characters fall into defined archetypes, their motivations are grounded in distinctly psychological trappings. Lena initially kisses Johnny to prove a point to her parents. Lena constantly looks for reasons as to why Johnny can be trusted or has changed his ways. Lena having affection for someone who belittles and seemingly berates her and disrespects her. This is an uglier side of male-dominated assessments of female psychology. These tropes bother me also to a point, even though I don't like finger-wagging at old films if I can avoid it. And then Johnny having that change of heart wherein he wants to stop being a burden to others and removing himself from the world. These are all very melodramatic scaffolds, but rooted in more than modern psychology than a sense of cosmological purpose or Christian duty or the pre-psychological, sometimes clunky existentialism of 19th century novels. As a script, Suspicion's merits are in manicuring the camera around itself. It is as good-looking and photographically impressive as any of Hitchcock's black and white films, which is to say perhaps as good as anyone's black and white films. Credit here must go to the great Harry Stradling. But also in its use of music. We have an extremely considered use of Johann Strauss's waltz, Wiener Blut, and different versions of the composition depending on what is occurring on screen at the time. Then it also has, the film Suspicion also has me considering what I read from Zizek quite recently, read aloud in my too long Man Who Knew Too Much video. Hitchcock's films retain a timeless quality partly because the alternate paths which the characters could have travelled are eternally haunting them. The potential possible avoided outcomes of lived existences are eternally presiding over the modern existence, partially validated by the scientific consideration of alternate worlds, timelines, dimensions. One sense of religious derived cosmology and destiny is replaced by chaos, an emphasis on the impact of decisions, forever haunted by what could have been, even in an otherwise happy ending or outcome. We take for granted how people would have felt in a totally different understanding of the world. The scientific secular model of the universe was hardly popularized until after the Second World War. One simply sooner accepted their place in life in a cruel societal hierarchy and believed in more absolutist ideals versus the relativism and uncertainty in human good or intrinsic sense of morality. All that morality governs our universe in any way, shape, or form, suggesting a non-Christian or non-religious worldview in the West or many places was total sacrilege, unheard of, cosmologically and then psychologically rare. Barely any people would have the concept of a brain that might be remotely deterministic. Few accepted that humans were another animal evolved from and still taxonomically apes. Though Hollywood films still mostly reflect a binary structurally determined, the hero is convicted and brings his will to power mold, despite Hitchcock's incredibly popular films presenting a model more apt for the age in which they were released and popular, the 20th century, but especially for beyond that, when in the 21st century, internet paths and seemingly infinitesimal sources of information or insight disintegrate the notion of one unquestionable good or anything beyond prospective chaos, good fortune rather than a good God, justifications for feeling psychologically secure, or that, to put it simply, that life functions like a Hollywood screenplay. Even if Hitchcock's films are, and Suspicion in particular feels like this, ultimately, determined by the loud contrivances of the screenplay, their protagonists are haunted by the other possible outcomes of the events in question. The notion of a happy ending is usually fraught with not bliss, but relief. Even North by Northwest's happy ending is presented to us via what was a secret flashback of a haunting traumatic event, that of the famous Mount Rushmore climax. Suspicion's ending was not as bleak or morbid as desired supposedly by Hitchcock, though it still wallops a view of great uncertainty, especially for an old Hollywood piece. All throughout Suspicion, the notion of what could be but might not, the alternate possibilities beyond what Johnny's claims of the truth are, they haunt the film to the point wherein Lena might have to wonder. Her paranoia can be translated as, what genre of film am I trapped inside? Is it a hokey love story, a romantic tragedy, a sinister murder thriller, or some yarn of a woman unfretting over the runtime? In terms of execution of tropes, Suspicion is Hitchcock at his best cinematically. Whether he transcends the tropes is debatable, but it is a masterclass in the portrayal of dramatic pathological extremes in a more cinematically expressionistic context than in a more, say, social realist context. Hitchcock wasn't a practitioner of the latter, didn't pretend to be. He revelled in sensationalism. And yet, compared to Hollywood then, even Hollywood now, he understood, incidentally perhaps, the modern pathological experience better than most artists in possibly any medium ever have so. Remember, I've cited before what I consider a very powerful and instructive John Luke Goddard quote in his famous review of The Wrong Man. He claimed that Hitchcock's films proved that cinema was the best format at illustrating the data of consciousness. And I'm going to claim that Suspicion is another instance of this, especially of what I was talking about with Zizek's claim that the Hitchcock filmography delivers instances of characters fraught by what could have been, rather than sort of blissfully and sort of ignorantly written as being on a conveyor belt, effectively, narratively. Anyway, we'll close it here. Thank you everyone again.